And so this is Christmas. Well, that is how the song by John Lennon starts. It goes on to say, and what have you done? Another year over and a new one just begun. But hold on, this has not been Christmas at all. We have just come through, not Christmas, but Easter. John Lennon, in his largely self-appointed role of social critic, was asking us to consider our lives in the light of Christmas, as it is celebrated at the end of the year. Reflect, he says, on what you have been doing for the past year, and by inference, what are you going to make of the next year? But that's Christmas. Easter never seems to have the same impact that Christmas has. Christmas, you have this young couple, the wife having, or the woman having a baby, sort of like a refugee status, heading off to Bethlehem, and we're not quite sure of the bureaucratic reasons for that, but that's where she had to go. And then of course she had to take off with Joseph later on off to Egypt. That is something that has a bit of traction. But it doesn't seem quite the same with the Easter story and the crucifixion. We know lots of people back in history who have been cruelly treated, badly treated, and I think we vainly think we passed all that back by and now we're on to something different. And so Easter never quite has that sense about it that Christmas has for people in general. I'm not talking about here about Christians. The very idea of focusing on a cross, which is really just a method of execution, is really quite bizarre anyway when you think of it. I mean, do we anywhere else in civilization focus on a method of execution? Christians are in the habit of talking about the way of the cross, and that is the title to this message this morning. It means something to us. But would anyone talk about the way of the gas chamber, or the guillotine, or the firing squad? And what would they ever say about the meaning of that to our lives? And would we wear an electric chair around our necks with jewellery? But the truth is that the cross and what it signifies is at the very centre of all we say, be and do as Christians. And there are very good reasons for that, which is perhaps why we ought to say. And so this was Easter. And what have we as a church done? And it was really great and really encouraging to hear what I guess David put together in the songs before, and how they did focus, and also the community, on the work, the person and work of Jesus Christ. Because our Easter is not just about Easter bunny and chocolate, though we might like to give that to our kids, and I'd like to have some ourselves, I guess. It's more than that, more than hot cross buns. We remember Easter because of what the Apostle Paul says, as we heard read this morning. In 1 Corinthians 1, 22 to 25, he says, "We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and to the Gentiles, foolishness. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power and wisdom of God." And so Easter for us in the church is not just an excuse for another holiday, a time off. It's a time for us to remember, though we should be doing this all the time, what Christ did and what Christ accomplished at Calvary. And the church, this church, any true church, exists because it is charged with that message to proclaim this to the world. we are the body of Christ, and in preaching the cross, we do so against the backdrop of a holy God who demands that we be righteous and holy as he is holy. God has high standards for humankind. In the New Testament, we see Jesus, we read of what Jesus does in discussing these high standards. In Matthew 5:20, we read that he plainly told the people of his day who thought that the Pharisees and scribes had too high a standard, that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you have no chance of seeing the kingdom of heaven. Jesus went on then to describe a much higher standard in matters, say, murder and hatred, matter of divorce and relationships. Clearly it was a standard that they were never going to reach up to. But Jesus, as we remember at Easter, came to earth to die on the cross. As Paul states in Philippians 2:6, Jesus thought that equality with God was not something to be held onto, but he willingly gave up himself. He gave himself, someone who knew no sin, as Peter says in 1 Peter 3:18, for Christ died for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. And so we preach a righteous Son, who willingly, in love, gives up all that he might legitimately claim, to die and be our righteousness. That is to say, he fulfills the righteous demands of a holy God on our behalf, so that God sees not our unrighteousness. If you're anything like me, there's plenty of that. But the righteousness of Jesus Christ, which is accounted to us as we live by faith. For as Habakkuk says in chapter 2, verse 4, and Paul reiterates in Romans 1:17, and everything that Jesus said and did proclaims out loud to us, those who are righteous by faith shall live. And so our first point in this morning's message is the way of the cross is the way of the forgiveness of sin. I'm going to read a poem written by John Newton. John Newton was the slave trader who lived for a time as a virtual slave to a black woman until in due course the Lord drew him to himself. He's most famous for writing that classic hymn, Amazing Grace. But he wrote other things as well. And this is a poem that some of you, you're a bit older like me, will remember was sung quite a lot back in the 60s as a solo. And I wanted Anita to sing it this morning, but unfortunately she has some family things to attend to and couldn't do it. But anyway, I'll read this poem. In evil love I took delight, unawed by shame or fear, till a new object struck my sight and stopped my wild career. I saw one hanging on a tree. That's where the song starts now, remember? In agonies and blood, who fixed his languid eyes on me, as near his cross I stood. Sure never till my latest breath can I forget that look. It seemed to charge me with his death, though not a word he spoke. My conscience felt and owned but the guilt, and plunged me in despair. I saw my sins his blood had spilled, and helped to nail him there. Alas, I knew not what I did, but now my tears are vain. Where shall my trembling soul be hid? For I, the Lord, have slain. This is another part you remember if you really remember the song. A second look he gave, he said, I freely all forgive. This blood is for your ransom paid. I died that you may live. Just while his death my sin displays, in all its blackest hue, Such is the mystery of grace. It seals my pardon too. While with pleasing grief and mournful joy, my spirit now is filled, that I should such a life destroy, yet live by him I kill. That was John Newton's take on it. The crucifixion occurred because of our sin. We are a part of humanity which, as a whole, is responsible for the cross as much as anyone. Not just the Jews, not just the Romans, not just the people who lived 2,000 years ago. Had we been there, no doubt we have had our part to play. Rembrandt, the Dutch painter, painted a picture called the Three Crosses. Okay, a bit hard to see there. I'm not an art critic, so I can't explain much to it. Your attention will be drawn first to the centre of the cross on which Jesus died. Then as you look at the crowd gathered around the cross, you'll be impressed by the various facial expressions and actions of the people involved in the awful crime of crucifying the Son of God. Finally, and I haven't been able to pick this out, but they say, the critics say, your eyes will drift to the edge of the painting and catch sight of another figure, almost hidden in the shadows. Art critics say this is a representation of Rembrandt himself. For he recognised that by his sins he helped nail Jesus to the cross. Good luck with that, buddy. How great is our sin? Just as God's standards are high, so is the severity, so is the greatness of our sin. It is so tempting to make light of our sin. There are many outside, non-Christians, who will say, well, I haven't done anything wrong, not much anyway. There are many inside the church who would likewise take their sin lightly as well, and speak as if they have a righteousness of their own. They constantly compare themselves to others. I guess we're all a little bit guilty of that, to say things, oh, you should see what she gets up to, though. I do more for the church than those others. They're always looking for something more than the gospel, too, something in church that should be enjoyable, entertainment or entertainment. They seem to think that they can come to Christ without really repenting for anything. This is sometimes called easy believism, or what Bonhoeffer probably would have called cheap grace. In a light-hearted but yet serious way, there was a premillennialist, just a few of them around, our pastor for one, who believes that before Christ comes again, the church will be taken out of the world. I'm not going to get into that debate. And this person said of the people in the church today that when the rapture comes, the church is taken away out of the world, there's probably still going to be enough in the church to carry on. Sad when you think of it, but maybe that is true of the institution of the church. We're not careful to be true enough. There was this argument that was had between Augustine, or Augustine, depending how you want to pronounce it. Catholics say Augustine, I think, and Protestants say Augustine, but that varies. And he was having an argument with a British monk called Pelagius in about the 5th century. Pelagius argued that it was possible for us as human beings to live righteously and do things that would merit God's favour. Augustine said it was not. And ever since, most mainline Catholic and Protestants have agreed with Augustine. I've quoted this a lot, and I apologise to people in my own group for quoting it yet again. In the 11th century, a Christian by the name of Anselm, he was Anselm of Canterbury, wrote a book, Why God Became Man, Herdias Homo, which translated means Why God Became Man. In it, Anselm responds to those who feel that by just saying sorry, one can be easily forgiven. He says to such who think like that, sorry, but you have not yet realised how great a thing your sin is. And so as we go on to Easter and we contemplate the cross and the suffering and the passion of the Son of God, we are caused to come face to face with the reality of our own sin. That is where the rubber meets the road. As the scriptures say, in Old Testament and New Testament, the Old Testament, in the Psalms we read, they have all turned aside, they have all together become corrupt. There is none who does good, no, not one. And as Paul says in Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And we are then reminded of those beautiful words out of Isaiah. I would have to say, when it's pointing forward to Christ, they are among the most beautiful words ever put from pen to paper. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, and yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearer is silent, so he opened not his mouth. And so as Christians, the ones who have been forgiven, we preach the gospel. The law condemns us and reminds us of the great burden of our own sin and how great a thing our sin is. But the gospel is pure sweetness. We can have a song in our heart because Jesus is Christ. Because of him we are forgiven as we put our faith in him. There's no gospel of Islam. There's no gospel of Hinduism. There's no gospel of Buddhism. There's no gospel of Shitu, Judaism, Rastafari, whatever you like. And in the past 30 years, we've well and truly been shown and proved that there never was, nor was there ever going to be, a gospel of Marxism and communism. But without Easter, there is no gospel. Now as the church proceeds forward, as we ourselves in the church, or whatever your church might be, it cannot do nothing else but keep this message to the fore in all that it does. The cross is then central to all we do and must continue to be central. It both condemns us and lifts us up by the faith we receive the salvation of the Lord, as by faith we receive. Our second point is this: the way of the cross is central to all that we do as a church. The church cannot be a place of entertainment. It's not a club for like-minded people. Though we might find people we like, we might have a good time at church. It's not a place we just accept without telling him the truth. Some years ago, I came across a newspaper article about a pastor's conference in the United States, in which a Zambian pastor was a guest speaker. His name was Conrad Mbiwi. He was pastor at that time, of a Baptist church in Zambia. Some who know him say he is the Spurgeon of Africa. So I guess something good can come out of Africa, right? I'm sure it's going to come out, Jack. He said when he's speaking to the assembled pastors, he argued that the primary content of all Christian preaching should be the cross of Christ. Such preaching will inevitably spawn the question, what has this person done that he should be the centre of our preaching? And we said, prompting the answer, he died for us. With the divided Corinthian church, including those who claimed allegiance, respectively to Paul, Apollos, Peter, and Jesus, and we said that Paul emphasised it was Christ and him alone who had been crucified. And we argued the biblical centrality of the cross can be seen in how the gospel writers slow the narrative as the crucifixion approached. If you think of the gospel, that's how they thought about that, but that's right. They slow the narrative as you come to the crucifixion punishment of Christ for sinners. He goes on to point out this is becoming less and less an emphasis in the ministries of so many people who still consider themselves to be preaching the gospel. And as I said, even though he's speaking to pastors, I think this applies to all of us. We need to keep it in mind. Where are we hearing that certain note, unmistakable note, that when we step back to the end of our messages, we can say that for sure that Christ has been portrayed before us as on a billboard, as one crucified for our sins. If we have abandoned the privacy of the preaching of the cross, we need to go back to that. Has that gripped you, he asked, to the point where you are fully satisfied to spend the rest of your days with that emphasis, playing on that one-string banjo, Christ and Him crucified? Does it pulsate you, he asked, that a man hanging on the cross in weakness and shame should be humanity's only hope? Can anything be more daft than that? In our work of preaching, we are not alone, he proclaimed. What we might be saying might be sounding as foolishness in the ears of the world, but oh, that we had to faith to believe that there is another, with a capital A, working alongside us, and if it pleases him, no one can resist. No one, however hostile they may be. If Ambiwi is right, and I believe that he is, then the work of preaching Christ crucified must be the work of the church, and we preach proceed on from this Easter. There is a world outside our front door that does not know, or does not understand, or can be bothered with the way of the cross. Nor does it understand, in the terms of Anselm of Canterbury, the seriousness of its own sin. We do. We do when we realise there is nothing that we can do to save ourselves. We do when and if we give the appropriate faith response to that gospel. We do when in getting a glimpse of the true significance of the cross that we preach, and when we consider what Christ has achieved for us on Calvary, and we realise that we can do nothing else before a just and holy, loving God. And so we move on from the cross to the response of faith, but in a sense, of course, we can never move on from the cross. Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. For in the gospel, a righteousness from God, from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith. It is the story that goes of Cyrus, the king and founder of the great ancient Persian empire. By all accounts, Cyrus was a truly noble leader. Even the Bible gives him a fairly good write-up. Once it was said, it is told that he had before him a captured prince and his family. When they came before him, the king asked the prisoner, what will I give if I release you? Half of my wealth, was his reply. And if I release your children, he said, everything I possess. And if I release your wife, Your Majesty, I will give myself. Cyrus was so moved by his devotion that he freed them all. As they returned home, maybe while they were waiting at the airport or something, the prince said to his wife, wasn't Cyrus a handsome man? With a look of deep love for her husband, she said to him, I didn't notice. I could only keep my eyes on you, the one who was willing to give himself for me. That is the mission of the church as we move on to this Easter. We cannot and we must not take our eyes off the one who is willing to give up himself for each and every one of us. That leads us to our third and final point this morning. The way of the cross is powerful. Consider the thief on the cross. As he looked across to Jesus, he was beaten. The Roman military officer on duty that day, as the crucifixion, looked up at the master and was beaten. He says, truly this was a righteous man. And after Luke recounts these instances, he goes on to record in Luke 23:48, something that we do not focus on much in our discussion of the cross. He says, when all the people who have gathered to witness as this side saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. They too were beaten by the power of the cross, and they could say nothing. Later on the road to Emmaus, the two disciples, when they understood what was in the scriptures, likewise were beaten, and they said, "Did not our hearts burn within us as he opened to us the scriptures?" When Peter preached at Pentecost, there were 3,000 people who were confronted with the power of the cross and were left with nowhere to go. They did not know what to do, and so they pleaded with the apostles to tell them what they must do. Finally, we can speak of Paul, of the apostle on the road to Damascus, left with nowhere to go and nothing to do. The power of the cross and the power of the gospel have claimed him and claimed him for people. How can we unleash this power in the church today? I think that the princess in the story of Cyrus gives us a clue. We must not take our eyes off the one who is willing to give himself for us. That, of course, is so frequently said in evangelicals, and perhaps we need to define it a little. When we say we must keep our eyes on the Lord, we mean that we must focus all our being on what he would want for us. And how could we know what he would want for us? Well, the only way we could know that is to study his word. As we study the word, we better proclaim the word and the gospel. The more the gospel is proclaimed, the more we are learning the old story of Jesus and his love. The more we learn, and the more we are able to proclaim, the more we learn and understand. And as we do all this, we are keeping our eyes on the Lord. As the writer of the Hebrews says in Hebrews 12:2, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, according to its shame, and sat down at the right hand of God. Yes, we preach Christ crucified. It's a message of forgiveness. It's central to all that we do in the church as Christians serving the Lord, and is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. Have you experienced that forgiveness this morning? Is the cross of Christ central to your life? Do you know the power of the gospel as a reality in your life today? We'll close now as we are to sing